They told me to choose one alien sister to help repopulate, but I chose both instead.
The wind on Dravanna cut through coats and found the skin. Ice dust clung to the marble steps of the selection hall and squeaked under boots. Malin Kareth paused at the door to steady his breathing. He disliked crowds and official rooms, and the summons had pulled him out of the archive vaults where the air was filtered and the lights were kind to the eyes. He had repaired brittle data leaves there for 20 years, a lone work that suited a quiet mind. Today was not that. Today was the Council's pairing protocol, and he was here because the population had fallen and the government had chosen a direct plan. Match willing human men with genetically compatible alien women to rebuild households, stabilize births, and keep outposts from dying. He did not argue with the reason. He hated the method. A guard scanned his wrist chip and waved him inside. The hall was wide and bright, the light hard and white under high skylights. The smell of disinfectant carried from vents in the ceiling, clean but sharp. Rows of men waited along a center aisle while clerks in gray stood behind podiums and called names. On the far platform stood two women together, set at a slight angle as if they had been placed and told to hold position. They were twins. The file had said so. Navira and Sorellen, mid-20s. Family killed during the food riots in South Quarter. No surviving kin. Both marked unsuitable for selection because they refused separation. The rule remained one woman per pairing. Their wraps were pearl-toned and thin, ceremonial garments designed for presentation rather than warmth. The fabric clung to the torso and split high on the thigh. Their skin was a clear blue, smooth under the lights, the tone deepening at shoulders and hips. Their hair, long and silver, had been brushed and tied at the ends with white ribbon. Bare feet on marble, ankles tense. Navira stood in front by a step, chin up, scanning faces without flinching as if refusal had become reflex. Sorellen stayed closer to her sister's shoulder, hands folded at her waist, gaze low, breathing shallow. Their posture told more than the file. They were bracing for the moment a man pointed to one of them and a door closed on the other. The clerk called Malin Kareth. He walked the aisle, noting the clipped rhythm of his steps and telling himself not to rush. He had considered not coming, but the summons had a legal weight he could not ignore, and the archive director had told him the pairing program relied on people like him who could offer a stable home, and that if he ever planned to have a family, this was the path the world now offered. He had gone home that night and stood at the window over the sea and felt the house as it was, quiet, ordered, warm in winter, and empty. He did not sleep much. In the morning he shaved, put on his wool-lined coat, and walked to the tram. At the podium, the clerk held a thin slate and spoke with a neutral tone that came from repetition. Per protocol, you will select one candidate. She will be registered to your household. A liaison will perform the medical compatibility verification and finalize the pairing code. Malin looked from Navira to Sorellen. He saw the small muscle in Navira's jaw tense when the word select landed, the same way he had seen technicians tense when a brittle sheet neared a tearing point. He noticed the way Sorellen's fingers pressed into the inside of her wrist as if grounding herself. The file's words, unsuitable, refusal, floated in the back of his mind and met the present image of two people holding themselves still because movement might be read as need. He heard his own voice before he had planned each step of what would follow. I will pair with both. The clerk did not look up at first. That is not. I understand the rule, he said, calm and even, and I am requesting an exception. Now the clerk looked up. She hesitated, weighed the request against the script, and tilted her head toward the senior officer seated a few meters away at a low desk. The officer, an older woman with cropped hair and a scar along her temple from the last year of the wars, raised an eyebrow and motioned them over. State your name and residence, the officer said. Malin Kareth, Cliffside Dwelling, Sector North Coast. Registered as single occupancy household. Adequate space for 3 adults. He met her gaze. I have reviewed both files. I will formalize guardianship for both. I will accept financial penalties if policy requires it. What is your occupation, Mr. Kareth? Archival restorer. Pre-collapse documents. Ministry of Records. Why request two? Her tone was direct, not hostile, and it steadied him. Because pairing one and discarding the other serves no one. You ask for future households and stable births. You get neither if you break them at the door. He kept his voice low and firm. I also believe the council needs outcomes that hold. Keeping them together gives you that. She studied him. He could hear his heart, but kept his posture steady, grateful for the years of controlled breath taught by careful work. The officer glanced at the twins. Navira watched her back without blinking. Sorellen lifted her eyes, then lowered them, then tried again and held. The officer tapped her slate. There is no standing multi-candidate clause for general pairings. Understood. But the Post-Conflict Recovery Act allows pilot exceptions if projected household stability outweighs administrative cost and if a qualified guardian accepts responsibility. She exhaled once, made the decision, and spoke to the clerk. Draft a dual pairing under PCRA 12C. Set household code to Kareth 03. Register Navira and Sorellen as codependents for 14 months with elective review at 6. Medical compatibility has been cleared for both. The liaison medic stepped in with a handheld, checked both implants, and nodded. Clear. Genetic compatibility indices acceptable. The officer signed, then looked at Malin. You will report quarterly. Any concerns from them supersede your preference. If they choose to leave, you facilitate it. Understood. Understood. She turned to the twins. This is an exception. You're not property. You can file grievance at any time. She paused. Do you consent to this arrangement together? Navira answered first, steady. Yes. Sorellen's voice was soft but clear. Yes. The officer nodded. Then this is official. She rose, offered a practical smile that did not pretend the system was kind, only necessary. Good luck to all three of you. The clerk printed the pairing token, thin metal, stamped with a new code, and placed it in Malin's palm. It was warm from the machine. He felt its weight, and the weight of the decision settled together in a way that did not frighten him. It relieved him. He did not want to sneak or hide. He wanted paperwork and a clean line. A staff attendant brought 2 insulated cloaks and soft boots from a storage bin. The twins stepped down from the platform. Up close, Malin noticed small details the file could not carry. A faint scar at Navira's right hip where the wrap did not fully cover, a shallow cut on Sorellen's knuckle that had scabbed over, the way both had reddened skin along the tops of their feet from cold marble. He offered the cloaks without fuss. Navira accepted hers with a nod, her fingers brushing his in a deliberate test of space and intent. Sorellen took hers with a quick look at his face, checking for pressure or demand. He gave none. They walked together through a side corridor. No alarms. No chase. An admin guard held the door because his hands were full with the issued clothing and the pairing token. The air in the service hall was colder than the main chamber and smelled like stone dust and old heat pipes. Malin's thoughts were organized and simple. Get them warm, feed them, give them privacy, provide clear rules, and no surprises. He had learned that people handled shock better when the next hour was playing. The transport's heater took a minute to catch. Navira took the rear left seat and watched the city as it slid by, mapping routes and exits with a trained habit that suggested she had spent months measuring risk. Sorellen sat centered, cloak pulled close at the throat, shoulders finally lowering as warm air reached her. Malin kept his eyes on the road, speaking only when useful. You will have your own room tonight, he said. 2 beds. Locks work from the inside. The bathroom is through that room. Hot water is strong, but starts cold. I will cook. If you prefer to help tomorrow, we'll plan it. Navira's voice was careful. What is the rule for the house? Speak what you need. Touch only with permission. Sleep when you want. If either of you ever wants a door shut, it stays shut. Her eyes flicked to him, surprised at the clarity. He added what mattered to him. I do not drink. I do not shout. If I am quiet, it is because I am thinking, not because I am angry. Sorellen glanced at her sister and then at him. And why are you doing this? The question was small, but it held all the others. Because I want a home that does not feel empty, and because I believe you deserve not to be separated to make a spreadsheet look neat, he said. The answer felt true in his chest. He did not dress it with more words. The city fell away to low buildings and then to open ground. The sea came into view as a wide green sheet under the pale sky. Wind pressed against the vehicle. The road narrowed along the cliff. His house stood at the edge, stone walls set into the rock, windows facing the water, smoke from a vent pulled flat by the gusts. Inside, heat rolled from the large hearth. The room was practical. 2 fur-lined chairs by the fire, a low table with rings from past mugs, shelves of folded blankets, a kitchen alcove with metal pots and a water canister, hooks by the door with spare coats, and a long window that showed the sea he had watched every morning for years. The air smelled like pine resin and boiled grain from last night. He hung his coat and set the pairing token on the shelf where he kept documents. The small click of metal on wood felt like a gate closing on the hall and opening on the life that would follow. He moved through the space without hurry so they could watch and learn its shape. "You can change in the back room," he said, placing 2 sets of wool trousers and shirts on a chair. "They're too big, but they are clean and warm. I will make food." Navira took the clothes and gave him a look that asked if he would hover. He didn't. He turned to the kitchen and filled a pot. Sorellen followed her sister, then paused in the doorway and spoke without turning back. "Thank you for asking the officer, not sneaking. You are registered here," he said. "Nothing hidden." Steam filled the kitchen. He salted the grain and set a kettle to boil for tea. He listened to the house, the soft thud of the bedroom door closing, the clink of a drawer slide, the scrape of a chair as he pulled it out with his knee, the steady pulse of the fire. He felt the line of tension that had held since the summons loosened in his back and understood it for what it was. Fear that he would be forced to play a part he could not live with. He had avoided it. He had chosen a way he could defend. They returned in oversized shirts and trousers rolled at the ankle. Navira's hair hung straight down her back, the ribbon now tied at the end to keep it from tangling. Sorellen had pulled hers into a loose knot, a few strands along her cheek catching the firelight. Both wore socks and moved more easily with warm feet on warm floors. They sat at the small table. He placed bowls of grain and set out a jar of preserved sea greens and a plate of sliced root. They ate without ceremony. The food was plain but hot, and he could see the way warmth settled into their faces, easing the clench along the jaw and the small lines at the corners of the eyes that come from bracing too long. Navira spoke first. "What do you expect from us here?" "Nothing today," he said. "Tomorrow we talk about the house. We plan tasks you like and tasks that need doing. You set boundaries. We follow them. The council asks for births. That is not a schedule. That is a choice. We make it when you are safe and ready." She held his gaze, weighing the words for traps. She found none and sat back a little, her shoulders lowering for the first time. Sorellen's voice came next, quiet and clear. "If we cannot sleep, can we sit by the fire?" "Anytime." They finished the meal. He washed bowls while they watched the sea. He showed them the sleeping room. 2 beds, fresh furs, a chest for clothes, the bathroom door to the left. He pointed to the door lock and tested it from inside and outside, so they could see it worked. He placed a pitcher of water on the small stand between the beds and stepped back. "You are safe here," he said, not as a promise he could not guarantee for all future time, but as a statement about this house and this night. Navira nodded once. "We will sleep," she said, and for the first time her voice held something like relief rather than edge. Sorellen looked at the window where the last light dulled over the sea and then at him. "Good night, Malin." "Good night." He closed the door and returned to the main room. He added a log to the fire and sat. His hands were steady. He reviewed the day in order to anchor it. The hall, the officer's decision, the weight of the token, the first question at the table, the first honest answer. He understood his mission in terms the council would accept, contribute to recovery, build a stable household, support births when they chose, and in terms that mattered to him. Keep people together, do no harm, make a home that holds. Wind pressed against the windows. The glass hummed. The house stayed warm. He thought of the 2 beds in the back room and the quiet beyond the door and felt a clear, simple certainty rise in him that he had done the right thing. He planned the morning. Clothes from the storehouse in the village, more tea leaves, fresh bread from the baker if the road stayed open, a list of repairs for the upper vents before deep winter set in. He pictured small things that build trust, letting them choose where to place their belongings, showing them the safe path along the cliff, explaining how to call him if they woke and needed him in the night. He sat until the kettle clicked as it cooled. He poured one last cup, drank it slowly, and finally let himself feel tired. When he turned down his own bed, the house creaked the way it always did in wind, but the sound did not feel like loneliness anymore. The wind had eased by morning, but frost still clung to the edges of the window panes. Pale light washed across the stone floor, catching the thin swirl of steam from the kettle Malin had set on the heating coil. The smell of boiling grain filled the air. He moved quietly, aware the back room door was still closed. The first night in a new place could mean restless sleep, and he didn't want the sound of clattering pans to be the thing that woke them. When the door finally opened, Navira stepped out first. She wore the wool shirt from last night, cuffs still rolled, hair falling loose down her back. Her eyes swept the main room, checking details. Fire still lit, front door locked, no sign of anyone else. Sorellen followed, her hair tied back with the white ribbon, the oversized trousers rolled at the ankles. She looked toward the hearth before anything else, moving closer to the warmth without speaking. Malin noticed both still wore the insulated cloaks over their clothes. The house was warmer than outside, but the habit of guarding against cold wasn't one they would shake in a single night. He pointed to the table where mugs of tea waited. "Still hot," he said. Sorellen took hers with a quiet, "Thank you." Navira hesitated, then sat opposite him. The sound of the wind outside filled the pause between them. There were questions he knew they had, and questions he had for them. Some had been unspoken the night before, because exhaustion had made any conversation feel heavier than it needed to be. Now, with daylight through the windows and the smell of food softening the room, it felt possible to address them without pressing too hard. "You've been together since the riots?" he asked, voice steady. Navira nodded. "We were away from the house when it started. Came back and..." She didn't finish. Sorellen's hand brushed her sister's forearm, a small, grounding gesture. "We stayed with others for a while. Not family, just whoever would let us inside. Then the summons came." Sorellen spoke without lifting her gaze from her tea. "They told us we couldn't choose each other, that it wasn't the program's design." Malin kept his eyes on them, not the table. "You didn't have to agree to be paired at all." Navira's lips pressed into a line. "We didn't agree to be split. That was the choice left to us. Go separately or go back to the holding center until someone else decided. And no one leaves the center the same." Her voice carried no tremor, but the weight in it was enough to tell him the rest didn't need explanation. He set the bowls of hot grain down in front of them. "You won't be split here. Not by me. Not by anyone while you're under my name." Sorellen finally looked at him, her eyes holding for longer than the night before. "Under your name means under your rules?" "It means under this roof," he said. "And rules are simple. Speak what you need. Do not harm each other. Respect space. Everything else we work out together." Navira ate without comment, though he could see in her posture that she was listening more closely than she wanted to show. Sorellen took slow bites, holding the spoon in both hands to warm her fingers. When they had finished, he pushed his chair back. "I need to go into the village today. Supplies, clothes that fit, fresh food. You can come or stay here. If you stay, you'll have a lock. I'll show you how it works." Navira's answer came without pause. "We'll come." Sorellen glanced at her sister, then nodded once. The decision made, he fetched the heavier outer coats from the storage chest near the door. Both tried them on, adjusting the fit. Navira's shoulders squared once the weight settled, as if she felt less exposed under the thick fabric. Sorellen pulled the hood up and tied it close beneath her chin. The walk to the vehicle was short but bit at the skin. Their breath clouded in the air. The transport's heater worked faster this time, and soon the windows cleared enough for the coastline to come into view, gray-green water under a sky the same color, the line between sea and horizon blurred. In the village, the streets were quiet. Most people kept to their own business, but a few pairs of eyes lingered on the unfamiliar women stepping out of the transport. Malin noticed Navira's gaze meeting those stares head-on, while Sorellen kept hers fixed on the ground until they were inside the first shop. The clothier, an older man who knew Malin from the archive, greeted him with a nod. His eyes moved briefly to the sisters, then back to Malin without comment. They left with 2 bundles, sturdy trousers, warm shirts, and lined boots sized to fit. At the baker's, the air smelled of fresh bread and boiled root. Sorellen's eyes flicked to the counter display, but she said nothing. Malin added 2 extra loaves to his order. By the time they returned to the house, the light had shifted toward late afternoon. He set the bundles on the table and stepped back so they could open them. Navira lifted one of the shirts, feeling the fabric between her fingers. Sorellen pulled on the new boots immediately, flexing her toes and looking faintly surprised at how warm they were. While they settled into their seats near the fire, Malin began preparing the evening meal. He could feel the house starting to change, not from anything obvious, but from the way their movements now carried less hesitation, the way the silence between words no longer felt like a wall. He didn't rush it. Trust wasn't one in a day. But as the smell of cooking filled the room and the sound of the wind faded under the steady crackle of the hearth, he knew the first barrier had shifted. Tomorrow would bring new questions, and he was ready to answer them as plainly as he had today. The next morning broke with a thin gray light spilling over the cliffs, the kind that blurred the line between dawn and full day. The wind had calmed, leaving only the distant, steady sound of waves against the rock below. Malin was already awake, sitting at the table with a stack of notes from the archive he had brought home last month. He wasn't reading. His attention was on the closed bedroom door. He wanted to see if the new clothes, the warmth, and the sense of choice from yesterday would change how they carried themselves today. When the latch turned, Sorellen emerged first, pulling her hair into a loose braid as she stepped into the main room. She wore the new trousers and shirt, the fit better than anything the council had issued, the fabric heavier and warmer. She glanced toward the window before crossing to the hearth, where the fire was still low but alive. Navira followed, her hair loose, one hand holding the edge of her shirt closed as if she'd thrown it on without fastening all the way. She scanned the room quickly before meeting Malin's eyes. "You're up early," she said. "I usually am," he answered. "The coast is quiet in the mornings. Easier to work." She tilted her head, as if weighing whether that meant he expected them to start working as well. He caught the flicker of the thought and answered it before she asked. "I'm not giving you tasks today. I want you to see the house, know where everything is. If something breaks, you'll know where to find what you need." That was one of the unspoken questions lingering since they had arrived. What exactly he expected from them here, beyond the council's broader goals. The file they'd been given before pairing would have listed shared domestic duties as an assumption, but he hadn't mentioned it until now. He wanted them to understand the difference between assumption and arrangement. They ate breakfast together, bread still warm from the village bakery, slices of preserved roots spread thin with salt butter. Sorellen stayed quiet, but she listened closely when he pointed out the store chest by the back door, the water pump in the kitchen alcove, and the small storeroom behind the hallway. Navira asked direct, functional questions. How often the chimney needed clearing, whether the road to the village stayed open in deep frost, what supplies ran out fastest. He answered all without dressing them in reassurance. By midday, the light had shifted brighter through the windows, and the air inside was warm enough for them to shed the heavier coats. Malin noticed Sorellen moving more freely, no longer keeping herself anchored to one spot. She lingered by the kitchen table, helping sort the dried herbs he'd laid out, careful not to mix the different scents. Navira carried in more firewood without being asked, setting it beside the hearth. Small acts, but different from the guarded stillness of the first night. When the house settled into an afternoon quiet, Malin took the chance to address another question he knew they had. What the council expected from them now. The program wasn't secret, and they were not naive about the role they'd been assigned, but the terms had been left hanging between them. He didn't want it to stay that way. "You should know," he said, leaning against the table edge. "The council will check in at the 3-month mark. Not in person, usually through a liaison visit or a recorded report. They'll want to know if the pairing is functioning. There is no set deadline for anything beyond that. No schedule for children, No hidden terms. If they tell you otherwise, you bring it to me. Sorellin's hands stilled over the herbs. And if we choose not to, then we don't, Malin said simply. Navira's gaze sharpened. The council won't like that. They won't like anything that isn't efficient, he said. But they made this arrangement official, and that means they'll honor the choice as long as the household stays stable. That's my job, to make sure they can't claim otherwise. It wasn't the answer of someone trying to win their trust with charm. It was the answer of someone who understood the framework and knew how to keep them inside it without being cornered. As the light faded, the wind picked up again. Sorellin lit the lamps while Navira helped him secure the shutters on the ocean side. Dinner was simple, thick grain stew with the last of the sea greens from the jar. They ate near the fire, the warmth making the room feel smaller but not confined. After the bowls were cleared, Navira surprised him by speaking without the usual caution in her tone. This place is quiet. Too quiet sometimes. It's been that way for years, he said. She studied him for a moment. You didn't take us to fill the silence, did you? No, he answered. I took you because you were worth keeping together. She didn't reply, but he caught the way her shoulders eased slightly. Across the hearth, Sorellin sat with her knees pulled up under her, watching the fire but listening to every word. That night, as they closed the door to their room, Malin realized the house no longer felt like it had 3 separate occupants. The day had been unremarkable in the way only important days could be. Small exchanges, clear answers, the absence of anything that would make them doubt where they stood. The council might see it as a household forming on schedule. He saw it as something slower, more deliberate, and much harder to break. The weather turned overnight. By morning, the wind had shifted inland, bringing a steady drift of fine frost against the windows. The house felt more enclosed than usual, the outside world reduced to the muted sound of air moving through the cliff vents. Malin kept the fire high from the moment he woke, knowing the chill would settle into the stone if he let it fade. Navira came out first, her hair still damp from washing. She had tied it loosely, letting strands fall over her shoulders, and wore one of the heavier shirts they'd bought in the village. She lingered in the doorway between the hallway and the main room, watching him pour tea into 3 mugs. There was something different in her posture, less guarded but sharper in focus, as though she was gauging him rather than the room. You're up early again, she said. Fire doesn't keep itself going, he replied, sliding a mug toward her place at the table. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the back of his hand when she took the mug. It wasn't an accidental touch. He caught the faint tilt at the corner of her mouth. The way her eyes stayed on his just a fraction longer than politeness demanded. A test, and not a subtle one. Sorellin appeared moments later, moving slower than usual. She kept her cloak draped over her shoulders, even inside, and went straight to the fire before speaking. It's colder today. It will stay that way until spring, Malin said. He noticed her eyes looked faintly red, not from the cold, but from lack of sleep. You didn't rest? She shook her head slightly, still facing the hearth. I woke up a few times. Couldn't get warm again. Navira glanced at her sister, the teasing edge gone from her expression. You should have come closer to my side of the bed, she said, matter of fact, as if this had been a habit before. I didn't want to wake you, Sorellin murmured. It was a small exchange, but it told him more about their nights than any file could. They were used to relying on each other for comfort in cold or unease. But last night Sorellin had chosen not to, maybe out of uncertainty in a new environment. After breakfast, Malin brought out a folded wool blanket from the storage chest and handed it to Sorellin. Keep it with you today, he said. She hesitated, then took it and pulled it around herself. The day was too cold for long work outside, so he showed them the storage alcove by the kitchen, spare lamps, repair tools, extra blankets. Navira asked more questions than her sister, but her focus wasn't only on supplies. She kept closing the distance between them in subtle ways, standing close when he pointed out where things were kept, brushing his arm when they both reached for the same drawer. Each time, he kept his tone steady and his movements deliberate, showing that her proximity didn't unsettle him, but also that it didn't earn an immediate reaction. By mid-afternoon, the wind was stronger, and he decided to check the vent covers on a roof. When he returned, the fire was burning higher, and the smell of boiled grain filled the air. Navira stood by the hearth, stirring the pot. Sorellen sat in the chair nearest the fire, the blanket around her, and a mug of tea in her hands. "You cook?" he asked Navira. "I can follow instructions," she said, turning the spoon once more before setting it aside. "Thought I'd see if you'd eat something I made." They ate together in the warm light, the sound of the wind against the shutters fading under the quiet rhythm of conversation. Navira spoke more freely now, asking him about the cliff paths, the distance to other houses, the ships that passed in summer. Sorellen stayed mostly silent, but seemed less withdrawn, occasionally glancing up from her bowl to listen closely. After the meal, Sorellen rose first and began clearing the table. Navira stayed seated, leaning back in her chair, eyes fixed on Malin. "You're not what I expected," she said plainly. "What did you expect?" he asked. "Someone who'd take what the council gave him and make sure we remembered it," she said. "Rules first, names second, and now." "I think you mean what you said about keeping us together," she admitted, the words sounding reluctant, as if saying them out loud cost something. "That won't change," he said, meeting her gaze without hesitation. It was Sorellen who ended the moment, returning from the kitchen with the mugs. "The fire's dropping," she said softly. Malin stood to tend it, and as he did, he caught the briefest glance between the sisters, an unspoken exchange he couldn't fully read. It wasn't distrust, but it was something that would take more time to understand. For now, the house was warm, the wind stayed outside, and the fragile sense of safety they'd been building held for another night. The frost came heavier overnight, layering the windows in a thin white film that blurred the horizon into a pale haze. The sea below was almost silent, its surface slowed by the cold, only breaking against the cliffs in the occasional muted swell. Inside, the house felt smaller, the air warmer from the fire that had burned through the night. Malin had risen before the sisters again, adding logs to the hearth and boiling water for tea. He was halfway through slicing bread when Sorellen appeared in the doorway, the wool blanket from yesterday still wrapped around her shoulders. She moved more easily now, her steps quieter but not hesitant. Her hair was loose, falling forward as she reached to tuck it behind one ear. "Morning," she said, her voice soft but clearer than he'd heard before. "Morning," he replied. "Hungry?" She nodded, setting the blanket aside as she took a seat at the table. He noticed her eyes briefly trace the countertop and the small knife in his hand before returning to him, a habit of quiet assessment she seemed to share with her sister, though hers was subtler. As he set her plate down, she asked, "You always wake before the sun?" "Always," he said. "Old habit from the archives. Easier to work when no one else is moving around." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "It's better like this. Quiet." Her tone made it clear she wasn't talking only about the hour. They ate without rush. When Navira finally emerged, she wore the heavier trousers and shirt again, sleeves rolled, hair tied back. She greeted neither of them immediately, instead going to the window to scrape a patch clear with the side of her hand so she could see outside. "No ships," she said after a moment. "Not until spring," Malin told her. "Ice pushes the routes farther out." She turned to face them, one eyebrow raised. "Then I guess it's just the three of us for a while." "That was always the plan," he said. The rest of the morning unfolded without urgency. Malin brought out a small toolbox and showed them how the hinges on the shutters worked, where the vent covers could be checked from inside, and which cupboards held the extra fuel bricks for the heater. Navira followed him room to room, leaning casually against door frames while he explained each thing, occasionally stepping closer than necessary, her hand brushing his arm as she passed him in a narrow hallway. Sorellen, in contrast, stayed near whatever he was showing, memorizing positions and asking precise questions, as if determined to be able to handle it alone if needed. By midday, he was splitting firewood in the covered side shed while the sisters prepared lunch. When he returned, the smell of warm bread and root stew met him at the door. Sorellen was stirring the pot, hair slipping loose from her ribbon, while Navira leaned against the table, cutting thick slices of bread. They ate together in the main room, the fire casting a steady glow across the table. This time, the conversation started without prompting. Sorelin asked him about the coastline paths, whether they led anywhere beyond the village. Navira wanted to know how often he left the house for more than a day. Not often, he said. The archive work I can do from here now. Trips are for supplies, repairs, and reports. And the council check-ins, Navira added. He nodded. Those too, but they're scheduled. No surprises. After the meal, Sorelin stayed behind to clear the table while Navira followed him to the small storeroom to help put away the rest of the supplies from their last trip. She handed him each item one by one, her fingers lingering just slightly against his when their hands met. You don't react much, she said suddenly. To what? To me trying to get a reaction, she said plainly. I notice, he answered, setting a jar of preserved greens on the shelf. But noticing and reacting are not the same thing. Her eyes narrowed, but there was a faint curl at the corner of her mouth. Maybe I'll figure out how to make you react. You might, he said, not challenging her and not encouraging her either. That evening, after the lamps were lit and the fire was built high against the cold, Sorelin came to sit near him while Navira stepped outside to bring in the last of the firewood. She held a small sewing kit in her hands, one of the few items they had brought from the council hall, and began repairing a loose seam in her sleeve. You meant what you said about us deciding, she said quietly. Yes, he replied. She paused in her stitching, looking up at him. No one else ever said that before. Then they should have, he said. Her gaze lingered for a moment before she returned to her sewing. When Navira came back in, brushing frost from her hair, she glanced between them, her expression unreadable. The rest of the night passed in warmth, the fire steady, the wind pressing against the windows but unable to get in. Malin knew something had shifted, not a full trust yet, but the beginnings of it. Sorelin was starting to believe his words, and Navira was still testing his boundaries. Both were steps forward. The frost on the windows was thicker that morning, a solid sheet that blurred the view entirely. Malin had to run his palm over the inside of the glass to clear a small circle for light. The sea was hidden under a pale haze, the horizon lost in a band of frozen air. He stoked the fire higher before starting the kettle, the sharp crackle of resin in the wood filling the room. Navira emerged first, but this time she didn't linger in the doorway. She crossed the room with a directness that felt intentional, brushing past him to reach for the tea mugs on the shelf. You were up before us again, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I usually am, he replied, keeping his focus on the kettle. You don't mind being alone in the mornings? She asked, setting the mugs down on the table. I'm used to it, he said, but I didn't take you in to avoid talking to you. Her mouth twitched at that, a flash of amusement she didn't bother to hide. She poured her tea, slid into her seat, and watched him move around the kitchen. The look wasn't casual. It was the measured observation of someone trying to read more than the words offered. Sorelin appeared a few minutes later, wrapped in the thick blanket again. She looked better rested than she had the day before, her eyes clearer. She moved straight to the fire, sitting in the chair nearest the heat. When he handed her a mug, her fingers brushed his briefly. She didn't pull away. Breakfast was bread warmed on the hearth, spread with preserved fruit and hot grains sweetened with honey. Conversation started slowly, with Navira asking about the day's plan. Roof vents, Malin said. The frost will build up under the cover if I leave it. I'll help, Navira said immediately. You'll need gloves, he told her. Sorelin stayed quiet until the end of the meal, then asked, What do you want us to do if you're away for more than a day? It was a question he'd expected, but hadn't yet addressed. The lock works from the inside. Don't open the door unless you know who it is. Keep the fire high. If something breaks, leave it until I get back. And don't go down the cliff path. Frost makes it dangerous. Navira raised an eyebrow. We can take care of ourselves. I'm sure you can, he said, but you don't know this ground yet. The rest of the morning was spent on the roof. Navira climbed the ladder with practiced ease, brushing frost from the vent covers while he checked the hinges. The cold bit into their gloves, but she didn't complain. Instead, she asked about the other houses along the cliffs who lived there, whether any of them had come to the selection hall this year. He answered directly, and she kept pace with his work until it was done. Inside, Sorellen had cleaned the table and reorganized the cupboards, the order precise enough to tell him she'd done it with care, not out of obligation. When he thanked her, she only shrugged but didn't hide the faint flush of her cheeks. The afternoon brought a shift. Navira lingered closer than usual while he repaired a loose hinge on the front door. She stood just behind his shoulder, close enough that he could feel her breath when she leaned forward to hand him a screw. "You don't flinch," she said quietly. "To what?" he asked, not looking up from the hinge. "To me being this close. I told you before, proximity isn't the same as permission." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped back with a faint smirk. "We'll see if that changes." Sorellen stayed near the fire that evening, reading through a small book from his shelf. When he asked if she understood it, written in a mix of common script and pre-collapse notation, she nodded and said some of it, enough to follow the story. It was the first time she'd admitted to sharing any skill from her past, and he made a mental note not to press too quickly for more. Dinner was quieter than usual, though not tense. Navira watched him more than she ate, while Sorellen seemed content simply being near the fire and listening. Before they turned in, Sorellen paused in the hallway, the blanket draped over her shoulders. "You meant what you said yesterday about us deciding when, if ever, we're ready for more?" she asked. "Yes," he said, meeting her eyes. Her voice lowered. "That's not what anyone told us before." "Then they didn't tell you the truth," he replied. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a single nod and went into the bedroom. Navira followed a moment later, glancing back once before the door closed. Malin sat by the fire alone for a while longer. He knew both sisters were moving toward trust, but in very different ways. Sorellen through quiet reliance, Navira through constant testing. Balancing the two without breaking either's progress would take care and patience. But tonight, the house was warm, the shutters held against the frost, and they were still here. That was enough. The frost outside had begun to thin under a rare streak of weak winter sunlight. Through the narrow gap in the window Malin had cleared, the cliffs showed sharp and pale against the sea, which rolled in slow, heavy swells. The air inside the house carried the dry heat of a fire that had been tended through the night. Sorellen was the first to rise. She moved quietly into the main room, wrapped in her thick wool shirt and trousers, hair loosely braided. She hesitated before speaking, watching him at the table where he was sealing a small repair on one of the vent covers he'd removed the day before. "Do you always fix everything yourself?" she asked, her voice soft but without shyness now. "When I can," he said. "Less trouble than calling someone out here." She stepped closer, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "Where we stayed before, no one fixed things. They just waited for them to break completely." She looked down briefly, then back up at him. "I noticed you keep the house warm, even when you're not in the room. You think ahead." It wasn't said like a casual remark. It was deliberate, something she decided to tell him. "That's what keeps a place livable," he replied. "You plan for the people inside it, not just the walls." Her lips pressed into a faint line, and then she gave a small, almost cautious nod. "I'm glad we're here." Before he could answer, Navira appeared from the hallway, already dressed, her silver hair loose and catching the firelight. She gave her sister a quick glance, as if reading the tone of the room before she stepped in. "What's the plan for today?" she asked. "Indoor work," Malin said. "Storm's coming in tomorrow. Needs preparation." The morning was spent checking the storage alcove, counting fuel bricks, and moving extra blankets into the bedroom. Sorellen followed Malin's instructions carefully, folding each blanket into neat, uniform stacks. Navira stayed close to him, insisting on helping with the heavier work, lifting the sealed crates of dried grain from the storeroom and setting them near the kitchen. She worked without complaint, but stayed close enough that every movement seemed calculated to close the distance between them. At midday, while Sorellen prepared food, Navira lingered at the table with him. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the wood, eyes steady on his. "You ever think about why you were summoned?" she asked. "I know why," he said. "Population program. Stable households. Recovery numbers." She shook her head slightly. "That's the official line. I mean, why you? Not someone else." They chose someone with a house, work that keeps him here, no history of instability, he said plainly. Navira's mouth curved faintly. And someone who doesn't scare easily. She sat back, still holding his gaze. Most men would have taken one of us and left the other. You didn't. That means something, whether you admit it or not. He didn't answer immediately. It means I made the choice I could live with. That's still not most men, she said, her voice quieter now. The conversation ended when Sorellen set the meal on the table. They ate together, the room warm and steady. Navira's questions lingered in the air, unspoken but not forgotten. That evening, as the sun fell behind the cliffs and the first streaks of incoming cloud moved in from the horizon, the three of them sat near the fire. Sorellen was sewing again, her focus on repairing the cuff of one of her shirts. Navira sat back in her chair, her gaze moving between Malin and the fire. Without warning, she rose, crossed the space, and stood in front of him. She leaned down, her hands braced lightly on the arms of his chair, close enough that he could see the fine frost still melting in her hair from earlier. "Tell me," she said quietly, "if I asked you for more than this, would you turn me away?" Her tone wasn't playful. It was a direct test, the boldest yet. He met her eyes. "Not until I knew you wanted it for the right reasons." She held his gaze for several long seconds, then straightened and stepped back. "Good," she said, almost to herself, before returning to her seat. Sorellen glanced between them, but said nothing, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. The firelight flickered across all three of them, the warmth in the room a sharp contrast to the cold pressing in outside. Malin knew this day had shifted something deeper. Sorellen had given her first unguarded acknowledgement that she felt safe here. Navira had tested his boundary in the most direct way yet, and he'd held it. For the first time since they had stepped into his home, he felt the weight of what they were building settle into something solid, something neither the council nor the winter storms could shake apart. The storm hit in the early hours, rattling the shutters hard enough to wake even the deepest sleeper. By the time Malin stepped into the main room, the wind was a constant low roar against the walls, carrying salt spray up from the sea. The air inside was warm, but the fire had sunk low. He added 2 logs, the flames climbing high enough to cast long shadows along the stone floor. The sisters emerged together from their room, both wrapped in the thickest wool layers they had. Navira had her hair tied back, ready for work, while Sorellen's braid hung loose over one shoulder. They didn't wait for him to tell them what needed doing. Sorellen went straight to the storage alcove for more fuel bricks, while Navira began checking the vent covers from inside, ensuring none of the wind pressure had loosened them. Malin moved between them, making sure nothing had been overlooked. The rhythm of their movement told him everything. There was no hesitation now, no silent glances to confirm each choice. They moved as if the house had always been theirs. When the wind reached its peak, they gathered in the main room. Malin had prepared a stew earlier, letting it cook slowly on the edge of the hearth. The smell of herbs and root filled the air. Sorellen poured tea for each of them, her movements calm and practiced. Navira sat opposite Malin, resting her elbows on the table. "This storm will close the village road for at least a day," he said. "We have enough for 3, more if needed." Navira smirked faintly. "You plan for worse than that." "I do," he admitted. "It's what keeps us from going hungry when the road's gone." Sorellen glanced up from her tea, and from freezing. They ate while the wind battered the house, the sound muted by the thick stone walls. After the meal, Navira set her mug aside and leaned back at her chair, studying him. "You know," she began, "when we were called to the hall, I told Sorellen there wasn't a man alive who'd take us both. I thought it was impossible. It nearly was," he said. "But you did," she said, her tone quieter now. "And you didn't just take us. You kept your word." Sorellen's voice joined hers, steady but soft. "We're not waiting for something bad to happen anymore." She looked between him and her sister. "This is home now." The words settled between them. Navira reached across the table, her hand covering his. Sorellen mirrored the gesture on the other side. Malin didn't move away. "Then we keep it that way," he said simply. The rest of the day passed in the steady rhythm of a household that knew each other's place. They tended the fire, checked the shutters, and prepared the evening meal together. When the light faded and the wind began to slow, the three of them sat by the hearth. Navira rested against his shoulder, her usual edge softened. Sorellen curled into the chair beside him, the blanket over her legs, eyes half closed from the heat. When the hour grew late, neither of them moved toward the bedroom. Instead, Navira shifted closer, her thigh pressing against his. Sorellen leaned forward from her chair, her hand brushing his knee. "Come to the room with us," Navira said, her voice low. There was no hesitation in him now. He rose, and they followed him down the short hallway. Inside, the lamps burned low, the firelight from the main room spilling through the open door. The two beds that had stood apart were now pushed together, the thick furs pulled back. Sorellen stood close enough for him to feel the warmth from her eyes steady on his. Navira stepped behind him, her hands resting lightly at his sides. They were not tentative. This was not a test anymore. It was choice. The furs were warm when they drew him down with them. Navira's mouth found his first, her kiss firm and certain, her hand sliding along his jaw. Sorellen's touch was slower, tracing his arm before resting over his chest, her fingers curling there as if to anchor herself. Their movements were unhurried, a deliberate closeness after weeks of silent negotiation and testing. Navira stayed close to his left side, her arm draped across his chest, her fingers tracing slow lines over the fabric of his shirt before slipping under it to find warm skin. Her touch was confident, not hurried, exploring the shape of him as if confirming what she'd already decided in her mind. Sorellen's approach was different. She shifted gradually, pressing herself against his other side, her forehead brushing his shoulder before she eased her arm across his waist. She stayed like that for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, before lifting her head to look at him directly. There was no hesitation in her eyes now, only quiet certainty. The heat from their bodies gathered under the furs, the air between them warm and close. Navira lifted herself just enough to look down at him, her silver hair falling forward to frame her face. She searched his expression, holding his gaze until she saw his unspoken answer, then leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was firm, lingering, and without any doubt. On his right, Sorellen's hand tightened slightly at his waist, her body pressing closer. She didn't compete for his attention. She simply stayed against him, her presence steady and grounding. The rhythm between them formed naturally. Navira's bold, exploring touches balanced by Sorellen's quiet, anchoring warmth. The world outside faded until there was only the sound of their breathing and the subtle shift of fabric and furs as they moved. Every glance was answered, every touch was met with a return, sometimes mirrored, sometimes countered with something slower, deeper. It wasn't a rush toward an ending, but a steady drawing together, the three of them learning the shape of this new closeness in real time. Navira's movements carried a sense of possession. When she settled partially above him, her hands framing his face, it was with the intent of claiming a space she'd been circling for weeks. Sorellen shifted closer from behind, her cheek resting against his arm, her hand smoothing down his side in quiet affirmation, her breath warm through the fabric. The warmth built slowly, like heat spreading through a room from a steady fire. The small sounds, the faint catch of breath, the shift of knees on the mattress, the low hum of satisfaction, blended with the flicker of the hearthlight spilling through the open door. They learned each other's pace in those minutes, the balance of boldness and restraint, the silent agreement that every movement would be returned in kind. By the time they finally settled, Navira lay draped across him, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing steady but still carrying the edge of exertion. Sorellen curled in close on his other side, her hand resting over his chest where his heart beat slow and even. The storm outside had quieted to a low, distant rush, no longer demanding their attention. In the dim glow, with their bodies tangled under the furs, the moment felt unshakably certain. Whatever had begun in that marble hall weeks ago had led here, to warmth, to choice, to a bond that no council order or winter storm could undo. The thaw came slowly that year. By late spring, the frost still clung to the shaded edges of the cliff paths, but the sea below had regained its restless movement, the ice drift breaking into smaller, scattered pieces. Malin had noticed the shift in the air first, the sharpness of winter replaced by the milder salt scent from the water, and then, more subtly, a change in the sisters themselves. It began with Navira, though she said nothing at first. She moved more slowly in the mornings, sometimes pausing at the table with a hand resting absent-mindedly on her stomach. Sorellen, always the quieter of the two, seemed more distracted than usual, her thoughts pulled inward. Malin didn't press. He learned by now that both of them would speak when they were ready, and not before. One morning, he returned from the village with a small sack of early greens and root vegetables. The air outside had been brisk, the walk uphill steady enough to warm him. Inside, the house was calm, the fire banked low. The bedroom door was ajar, and voices low, deliberate, murmured inside. Navira stepped out first, her expression unreadable until she met his eyes. Then she smiled in a way he had not seen before, a small curve of her lips that carried something deeper than amusement. Sorellen followed a moment later, her hand brushing along the doorway before she came to stand beside her sister. "We need to tell you something," Navira said. Malin set the sack down on the table. "Go on." Sorellen glanced at Navira, then back at him. Her voice was steady but soft. "We're both carrying." The words hung there for a beat. He understood them instantly, but it was the way she said it, without hesitation, without fear, that made the moment heavier. Navira's green eyes were locked on him, searching for his reaction. "We weren't sure at first, but it's been long enough now." "No doubt." He stepped toward them slowly, not out of uncertainty, but to take in every detail. The quiet pride in Navira's posture, the way Sorellen's hand now rested lightly over her abdomen. The unspoken truth that this wasn't just about the physical fact of it. This was about the life they had built here, the choice they had all made together. "You're sure?" he asked, not because he doubted them, but because the question needed to be spoken aloud. Sorellen nodded once. Navira added, completely sure. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Then it's settled," he said. "We prepare for 4 more than just us." The way Navira's smirk softened into a real smile told him his answer had landed where it needed to. Sorellen stepped closer, her eyes shining, not with tears, but with a light he hadn't seen in her before. The rest of the day moved differently. They made a list together: extra blankets, more food stores for the colder months, adjustments to the sleeping arrangements. Malin promised to reinforce the shutters before next winter and to build a second hearth in the bedroom. Navira argued for a cradle near the main fire instead, claiming it was the warmest spot in the house. Sorellen listened quietly, then suggested both, her voice carrying more confidence than when she had first arrived here. That evening, they sat together near the hearth. The firelight washed over their faces, the flames steady and bright. Navira rested her head against his shoulder, her arm around his waist. Sorellen leaned on his other side, her hand over his. There was no tension now, no unspoken uncertainty, only the quiet hum of a future already set in motion. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of open water. Inside, the house felt not just warm but full. The cliffside dwelling that had once been his alone was now the heart of something living, growing, and entirely theirs. Malin glanced at them both, then at the fire. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it here, together." Navira's answer was immediate. "That's the only way." Sorellen's was softer, but just as certain. "We know." The flames cracked, the sea murmured far below, and for the first time since the day in the marble hall, there was nothing left unresolved. The life they had chosen, against rules, against expectation, was no longer just theirs. It was already becoming something greater, and it would last.